Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Not Content Podcast. On this podcast, we pull from the seemingly endless queue of movies, television shows, maybe even other surprises along the way as part of our podcast channel, From the Queue. On this episode, we will discuss the fourth and final football movie of February, Varsity Blues.
Told you my cable cut off.
They're well trained,
Stick to the basics.
well disciplined. You disobey me, and I will bury you.
He's taking the call.
But now they're ready to play by their own rules. Now
Let's roll.
it's time to make some noise.
This is your opportunity. I don't want your life.
Varsity Blues,
What are you doing?
On, I'm wearing underwear.
rated R. Now playing in theaters everywhere.
Please subscribe, like, and review From the Queue on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform, especially Spotify and Apple, to get those positive vibes going on the algorithm. You can find us on BlueSky From the Queue. You can also find us through Instagram and Threads. And if you're listening to us on YouTube, all the links will be in the description below. My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Instagram at Jerome Cuson, at BlueSky, at Jerome C1985. My co-host is Brian DeBrain. You can find him on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. And Brian, all I can say is we are once again going back to the year 1999, which is generally regarded as one of the greatest film years of all time. And the two movies that we have chosen from 1999 thus far have been football movies. We may do something for 1999 a little bit later in the year. We'll see. But Brian, I don't know about you, but I walked into this dreading it a little bit because I was like, this is an MTV movie. Like, this is very much at the heart of like James Vanderbeek mania with Dawsons Creek. So like, is this movie going to hold up? And I think I like this movie more than you did. And it is certainly not without its flaws. It's not like the greatest movie ever made. I don't think it's as good as Any Given Sunday, but I surprisingly enjoyed this a great deal.
I mean, I enjoyed certain aspects to it. I just was kind of blown away at like the lack of like comprehension in terms of the plot mechanics in some of these scenes. Like, it was just kind of mind blowing how some of these things were getting, like how these kids were getting away with the things they were doing. Obviously, it's one of those things where it's like a cast of high school kids filled with 20-year-olds playing high school kids, and we get it. That's always been the gimmick with Hollywood, but it just felt so like you should have just made them college kids. I think the behavior would have fit the profile more. But again, this is kind of like a focus on like Texas football, and that's a kind of a like a religious kind of thing, and that kind of in those small towns that are just all about football. And then Friday night, I feel like Friday Night Lights came from this, obviously, because of the success of this movie. So there is a lot to a credit to this movie, but at the same time, I feel like the plot and the script has just not aged well at all. Characters like are memorable still. Like, there's still memorable characters in this movie, memorable moments, unfortunately, for vastly different reasons. But overall, I think the characters are the ones that kind of stay and probably are the ones, or the characters kind of stick out, and that's kind of what I think maybe Jerome is like clinging on to, because I feel like the characters in this movie are really fleshed out well, the protagonist and antagonist. We'll get into that in a second, because John Voight plays a really, really, I don't know, the most unlikable coach I've ever seen in my life. But I mean, I guess that's the point, right? That he had to be the villain of the movie. But if you look at the release date of this movie, it's January 15th. So this is the beginning of the year. We started out with Any Given Sunday, which was the end of 1999 in December. So it's kind of this weird thing. It's like you see like two different types of football movies in the same year, but one's targeted a different audience, obviously, and you can kind of see the difference. And clearly, Any Given Sunday is the more far superior film. But somehow, I think Varsity Blues has become the more memorable film because of those characters that kind of stick out and the memorable moments, and like, especially I really remember the dad's nose breaking for some reason, like a lot in this movie, and that is one of those things, like he puts the beer can on his head. That's one of those things that kind of sticks out. So I don't know if they just created, again, it's like one of those things with like Star Wars, like the original scripts are not so great, but they have these memorable moments. I think Varsity Blues has a lot of memorable moments, and that's what kind of makes it this thing that people are nostalgic for now, all these years later.
I think there are three things. I want to correct you. The Friday Night Lights book came out years before this movie did. So if anything, this movie would be based off of those books. I also want to point out that, of course, there's a Friday Night Lights movie that came out after this, and of course, a television show, which Jesse Plemons, baby Jesse Plemons, is in this movie. He is also, of course, one of the stars of the TV show version of Friday Night Lights. Also, I think there's three things about this movie that I think people latch onto, and maybe a fourth. In terms of just moments, there's three of them. There's Allie Larter in the whipped cream. Like, that is, of course, something that I think people really latch onto, especially the horny 14-year-olds that all really like this movie. The teacher revealing herself to be a stripper. I think that is a big moment for many. And of course, the iconic line said by James Van Der Beek, "I don't want your life." I am not going to do the actual impression, but I think those are the three moments. And I think Billy Bob as a character really stands out for people. And it's no wonder, because he would go on to parody this very same character in Not Another Teen Movie just a couple of years later. So it all makes sense in that way. And this movie made $50 million. I feel like this was a huge deal on home video. I feel like this is, again, when you get these low budget teen movies, there is a high return on investment in terms of people renting this, people buying the DVDs. So I feel like that is a really, really big deal. I think there's a number of interesting aspects to this movie. Of course, you got James Van Der Beek and Allie Larter, who both acted on Dawson's Creek. You also have John Boyd kind of coming off the peak of his powers, and boy, would it be a descent into utter madness for him, and to the point where he's not even a viable actor at this point here in the year 2024. You also have Paul Walker, this is just before he becomes a big star. 2 years after this movie, he is in the very first Fast and the Furious movie. You also have Amy Smart, who went on to some notoriety, although not a huge star by any means, but definitely somebody who went on to have a solid career in the early aughts. And I think it really comes down to James Van Der Beek, and it's so interesting to me. I mean, his career has just been like, he was in Dawson's Creek, and I think in so many ways, like, even though he was the lead of the show, he is very much like the fourth most important, like fourth biggest star. I mean, Michelle Williams is an Academy Award nominee at this point. Katie Holmes has had a lot of success and also married Tom Cruise, so that kind of put her at the forefront for a number of years. And Joshua Jackson has been in a number of very prestige TV shows. And, James Van Der Beek has certainly had some highlights in terms of his filmography, but this really was very much his peak, with Dawson's Creek being on at the same time as this movie. And this is very much a showcase for him. And I have to say, I think his performance holds up extremely well. And I think that's the thing that surprised me the most, because coming into this, I was like, James Van Der Beek, again, I have very not so good opinions about him these days, but I think he is a really good centerpiece to this movie. And I think that this movie works because he is really good in it. Like, in some ways, I think the John Moxon character is actually better than Dawson Leary.
Look, I never watched Dawson's Creek. I only knew James Van Der Beek pretty much from this movie. And to me, it's all about the facial expression this guy has. Because, like, if you see the intensity he brings in that speech at the end of the movie, it's like, okay, yeah, I'm on board, man. You got me. You're a leader. You're giving me this speech. You got this intensity on your face right now. He sells it well. And then there's that scene, like, where it's that barbecue, that scene I talked about where he breaks his dad's nose. there's a weird intensity on that dude's face where it's like he's got this deep, almost like trauma against this dad, and he just unleashes it in that moment, and you see his face. I think his facials in this movie are just incredible. It's like he sells the moments so well, and then especially like if he's trying to like when he's in the strip club, he's having that stupid grin on his face, that kind of thing. So he can do the comedy, he does the drama well, and this movie is trying to have that balance. They probably lean more towards the comedy in most cases, but I feel like and when they're doing the drama, he's delivering, and I think that's what kind of carries the movie. Because like there's a lot of unlikable characters in this movie, and he feels like one of the few that are very attachable and likable, and the audience can get behind. And he's become one of these like memorable sports figure in movies in modern times, I think. And I wouldn't even call this a cult movie. Like I said, this movie made money, right? So it's more of like a generational thing. It's like one of those things you kind of hand down to your next generation and show that movie as like that sports movie, that generational sports movie, especially with like, football families, I bet. Like, and Mox, the character, is very interesting because like he doesn't want a scholarship. He's just doing it because for the love of the game. But then that turns into the problem with the script. It's like the script is trying to deliver all these different messages. Like it's trying to be like, oh, we're against racism. Oh, we're against CTE. Oh, we're against hard parenting. Oh, we're against hard ass coaches. And at the end, like everyone just kind of like cheers at the end, and there's no resolution to anything. So it's just kind of like, okay, what are we doing here? We're trying to fill time to the big game. So that's kind of where I felt like the script kind of falters. But still, Vanderbeek is just delivering with these like intensity. And you mentioned that line, "I don't want your life." I'm not gonna lie, I may have used that line once or twice on my parents, not with the accent, but it's a very relatable line because if you're a teen watching this movie, you're obviously connecting with that line, and a bunch of us have gone through that, so it's very relatable. I think that's why that moment sticks with a lot of people. So, but unfortunately, there's other moments where some of the other characters are just kind of doing things for the sake of like eye candy. Well, unfortunately with Ellie Leiter, because like it feels like they could have just eliminated that whole storyline and the whole movie would have been the same. Same thing with like the stripper teacher gimmick, which is very strange because we were going through the plot holes of that one, me and Jerome on the texting, and it's just like so many things going past the checklist.
There's just the
Oh
issue
my
is
God.
just that there's no way that nobody else in the town would figure out that she is a stripper. Like if these high school age kids can go to the strip club, and obviously they're football players, so it's plausible that they would get in, but there is no way that like you're telling me half the fathers in this town are not going to the strip club. Come on. We're talking about a small town in Texas. There's just absolutely no way that she is getting away with it. And I think the reason that it's aged well in some form or fashion is there have been a number of teachers who have been fired for having OnlyFans accounts. So OnlyFans accounts are, I guess, kind of the new strip clubs in many ways. Probably a little bit safer in many ways as well. But I love the way that they established that Mox is a nerd by having him read Kurt Vonnegut at the beginning. They may as well have just had him read People's History of the United States, like Timothy Chalamet in Lady Bird, which is another. It's one of those like cliche tropes that if we're going to identify this character as like smart or radical, we have a selection of books at our disposal. So, yeah, reading some Vonnegut, not looking at the playbook. I mean, I think it works because they're trying to establish his character. John Voight is just a monster, and I appreciate the fact that they kind of go all the way with it. And I think John Voight's performance, regardless of what you think of him personally, this is a really good performance by him. And like this version of John Voight in 1999 probably would have played a very good Vince McMahon. But I think that their performances really stand out, and I think they are why this movie I think still works for the most part. And I think in terms of like the beginning, I really like the fact that they in the first game they kind of go through the motions of like what the team looks like. You have Paul Walker making this spectacular play. You establish the disgruntled running back who isn't really getting the opportunities because his coach is a racist. And I mean, I think that is a very, very real thing. And I think that angle of it in terms of having the disgruntled running back, I think that's part of the element that kind of works the best in many ways because it feels the most tangible. It feels like it does have a clear payoff. And I think Lyle Swinton as Wendell Brown, I think he does a very good job. He doesn't get a lot of dialogue, but I appreciated that scene by the lockers where Mox is just a good ally and is like, you know what, we're gonna get you some touchdowns. And I sent Brian a very special gift, a GIF of the Nation of Domination coming down the aisle and a white person holding up the fist. I thought that was very fitting. And yeah, I think the other thing I appreciate is that Mox has different relationships with each character, and I think they're pretty clearly defined. And the way that it comes across, and I'll end on this, is to me, he comes across like a sane man in an insane world. Does that make sense?
That's kind of the vibe I'm getting, because he's the only one with rational thinking and all the characters around him are acting crazy and stupid. Yeah, I get it. Especially like the Alley Lighter scene just gets me, because it's like, who the fuck does that with whipped cream? You know what I'm saying? Like that's such a porn thing, and they just put it in there because they thought, oh, it's gonna make 14-year-old boys horny, and it does. But it's just like, it's so degrading, because like she ends up delivering like really poignant dialogue at the end of that scene, and it's just like, God, I would really appreciate this performance and this dialogue better if you weren't covered in fucking whipped cream right now. And they just still, it's like, I don't know. It felt very degrading on that kind of end.
See, it's weird. Like, this is usually the stuff that I would complain about, but you're the one that's actually complaining about it. I think it's probably Ali Larter's best scene. I think she's a mixed bag in this movie, but I think that is probably her best scene. And you have her do it naked in the whipped cream because she's at her most vulnerable, and she is expressing vulnerability. I don't think it's subtle, but I think that's what they're going for, and I think it works out.
I don't know. It just seems so. I don't know, man. Can we at least put some clothes on her when she fucking says those things? But I don't know. I get the whole being at their lowest point, but it just seems so degrading in some way. But I don't know. I don't know if it ages well. To me, because like I feel bad for her as an actress, because I felt like from this role she went on to Heroes, and then she got screwed over in Heroes. It felt like that character of hers in like that first season, a lot of the characters actually got screwed over. But I don't know. I just feel like really sympathetic towards her. I guess her career just getting out, like just being pigeonholed into these kind of roles. These like, oh, the sexy blonde role, we're gonna put her in that one, and then because Heroes, she kind of broke out a little bit being a mother in that, and then they just kind of went away from that. So that's kind of my thing with that. If we ever want to talk about Heroes season 1 and the tragedy of all that,
and then never talk about any of the other seasons. I mean, the problem with Ali Larter is that, like, yes, the things that happened to her on the show, but like apparently she was also racist to one of the black actors. So yeah, I mean, and we'll get to one of the negatives is that there's so many canceled people in this movie, and we'll get to that. But I think just in terms of some of the other supporting characters, I love the idea that, okay, so we have one sex pot, we have the hot blonde, so we're gonna have Amy Smart dye her hair brown, and we're gonna make her like quote unquote ugly. Like, yes, she is going to be the quarterback's girlfriend, but we're gonna dress her down. We're not gonna make her up as much. I found that amusing. I think she was good. I think she's okay. I think that she is just somebody who is a pretty solid performer, and I don't think she's like Academy Award worthy, but I've never watched her in a movie and been like, God, she was terrible.
I liked her in I think it's what is that, Eurotrip movie? I think she's in Eurotrip, and I think that's where I remember her a lot the most.
Road Trip is what you're thinking of. Road
Trip, sorry. That Eurotrip is the offshoot sequel that we don't talk about. But Road Trip, I did sneak into it. I was a teenager, and yes, that was pretty awesome, as I remember. But in this case, like the character that she's playing, like she's doing a good job playing it. It's just, why are you mad at your boyfriend for being a starting quarterback? It's not his fault that the dude, that Paul Walker busted his leg. You know what I'm saying? It's like, what is she so angry at that he's embracing this leadership shit? I don't know. It was just so off-putting. It made me just not like the character. Like, what are you talking about? The dude's doing his job, and he's being a leader. And, like, you're so upset that he's, like, the star quarterback now. You want him to just be on the bench the whole time and just be in the background so you can just kind of, like, say you're dating someone on the team? It's like, that was just, like, so confusing in terms of motivation. So that had me, like, scratching my head. Like, why are you so mad at the guy? It feels like you're trying to push him away. And then by the end of the movie, they're just, lovey-dovey and everything's okay just because the season's over. So it just felt like she was just kind of like giving the cold shoulder for no reason other than just like, oh, you're a star now. I don't want to be with a star. It's like, come on. That was so mean and messed up. And it just had, you know what I mean?
See,
It's like,
and the thing is that 25 years later, usually I'm like, oh, the girl's clearly always in the right in these movies because men are terrible. This is actually one of those situations where James Vanderbeek was 100% in the right, and he's the one that absolutely. I think his behavior is consistently pretty positive. I think the temptation of Ali Larter is legit, and it doesn't bother me because I do appreciate the fact that he doesn't go through with it, and like he is smart enough to know like this isn't cool, like this isn't right. It just feels wrong, and that's really cool of him, and I think it makes it so plausible that he would come across like a leader at the end because you see him establish relationships with everybody and he is liked by everybody. Like he's always the one that's sticking up for Billy Bob. Like he has the moment with Wendell. Like he's already best friends with Lance. I mean, like to me, the way it comes across, the way that their relationship comes across is like Mox doesn't really want to be a football player. And the reason that he and Lance can be friends is because they're not really competing for the starting job. Like Mox is fine being a backup, just riding the bench, and he's fine with Lance being the star. And I think that's generally for the best, and that's how you get a good quarterback room. Is you don't have competition. You have one guy who's clearly the backup, and one person who is clearly the starter. So I think that's why it works. And I also want to point out that Scott Kahn as the wide receiver, boy oh boy, would he have been arrested for date rape like multiple times based on his dialogue.
the dude stole a cop car and rode it naked with teenagers inside and somehow did not get arrested? Like if he was black, my goodness, he would have been shot at. Like, come on, like I don't know. Maybe it's just 2024, Brian, just kind of like putting things in perspective. But my goodness, we're just getting away with that shit in '99. Again, that's why I said like the college. It's more like college football behavior than it is high school. But because it's Texas, the emphasis is more on high school football. So that's kind of like where I'm like, okay, I can kind of see the behavior and the writer's perspective on this. But yeah. And in terms of like the way that the football was filmed, it was actually filmed very well. And I actually looked this up before we even recorded. So the cinematographer is Chuck Cohen, and Chuck Cohen has done camera work on The Last Boy Scout, Little Giants, Any Given Sunday, other sports movies. So the dude's got experience, filming football, and he clearly did it right because I've been complaining about night shoots for football the last couple episodes, and they did a great job here, especially with blue. It's really hard to capture blue on camera sometimes, especially at night, and they really did a good job capturing those uniforms at night. I think it's, again, those spotlights, the way high school football is kind of presented compared to TV football, I think makes a big difference in terms of the light coming into the camera and how it looks. So that's kind of been my theory as to why some of these football games at night, especially with rain, are not filmed well at all. But in this case, there was no rain, thank God. And they just kind of let those uniforms shine because I really like those uniforms, man. They that sweet blue looking with the white. Yeah, I was really feeling the uniforms. And of course, if you look up the director of this movie, Brian Robbins, somehow he is now the president of Paramount, Jerome. I don't know if you want to explain how that happened, but he also directed Ready to Rumble, which we'll never talk about.
Which we will never review. We don't have a blacklist necessarily, but if we did, that would be on it. We will never review that movie because it is genuinely awful. I like wrestling as much as the next person, but holy shit, there is no way we are reviewing that. It's just irredeemable. Like No Holds Barred is terrible, but I think there's actually some redeeming parts to that movie, and we'll talk about it at some point. But Ready to Rumble just is irredeemable. I think, look, Brian Robbins, I mean, looking at the state of Paramount, it's easy to see why they're in the shape they're in when Brian Robbins is the president. I mean, a lot of his directorial efforts have a lot to be desired. This is probably one of his better movies, but you look at some of the things that he did after, and it's pretty bad. It's pretty dire. I also want to point out another cast member. Brian, do you know who Sarah Haley Finn is?
That doesn't ring a bell off the top of my head.
She is the casting director for every single MCU movie.
Oh, is this where she got her early, credentials on her
Yeah, I
resume?
mean, this is definitely earlier in her resume, but I know that she definitely got hooked up with Favreau at some point, because if you look at some of her other movies, they were Jon Favreau related. So like she was the casting director for Cowboys and Aliens. So it feels like she's a Jon Favreau person. I don't know how that connects to, if this connects in any way to this movie, but yeah, I definitely saw her name and I was like, hey, it's the MCU casting person.
Well, if you look at the casting in this movie, every casting feels right, and so that's probably her, like her effect, like the way she's affected like the MCU in terms of like putting the right people in the right spots.
Yeah, she's
This feels like
yes.
a really good casted movie because everyone fits the roles perfectly, and I guess this is a chance to talk about Ron Lester. 20 years old, 500 pounds when he was making this movie. We're talking about Billy Bob, of course. Look, I think he did a really great job, and I feel like him doing Not Another Teen Movie took away what the goodwill that I feel like he did in this movie. I know that sounds stupid, but I feel like they were really touching on some really dark stuff that, and even Sonny was touching on, right? I mean, no one's saying the word CTE at this time, right? So he's clearly got post-concussion syndrome, and they're just kind of like waving it off, and then he's like, "Oh, I got my CAT scan and I'm fine now," right? And then it's just like, "What? How did what?" And then I keep thinking like we never see the scene of him going to the doctor, and I keep thinking maybe there's a deleted scene where the doctor's probably a football fan and just kind of passed him. That's my theory as to how he got passed, because clearly the dude is like not mentally there after some of those hits he took in the early part of the season, right? So I don't know. It just feels like they were kind of brushing it off and kind of going away from that dark turn the movie was going towards, and just kind of went, "Oh, he's fine now. There is no CTE. He's fine. He's got to be okay, folks." And then it's clearly not, obviously, and clearly he's not even playing in that last game of the season. Maybe the last two games of the season, obviously. And it's just so like they're touching on these themes, like this one and the race theme, but they don't go with it, and that's where I kind of feel like the script kind of falters. Just again, it's like an MTV production, so I get why they don't go so deep into things, but I feel like they were right there. They were right there on those two subjects, and they just didn't execute it to the point where it's like, okay, now that's maybe this movie does have some meaning after all, and it just becomes a typical football movie by the end of it. So that's kind of where I'm disappointed, because like they really got to the CTE stuff with Billy Bob, and they just kind of ignored it by the end.
I would mostly agree with the casting. I think in terms of the teams, I think they did a really good job. And like John Voight and bringing in actual announcers to call the game, I think that was all good. I mean, the parents, no real names. No, like there's nobody that I specifically noticed who I think really stood out. But I think the parents are just cartoons. There's no rational thinking, and maybe this is plausible. Certainly, I'm not going to say it isn't. But in terms of an interesting movie, like having none of the parents be sane is just, it makes for a really odd experience. I think it makes it really difficult. And I don't know, man. In terms of the Moxon family, you have John, who is clearly very interested in academics, getting an academic scholarship to Brown. And then there's his little brother, and boy, oh boy, his little brother is experimenting with different religions, and he feels like he is in a very different movie than everybody else. Joe Pitchler as Kyle Moxon. Brian, I think this is a situation where you and I differentiate a great deal. What I want to point out is that so you mentioned Ron Pester, right? Ron
Did I?
Lester?
Did I?
Yeah, you mentioned Ron Lester. So
Oh,
Ron Lester,
yes.
unfortunately, he passed away. He lost a lot of weight, and then he passed away a few years ago. I also want to point out that the actor who played Kyle has been missing for 18 years. So we don't know where he is. We don't know if he's alive. He's presumably dead. But it's what's happened to so many of these, some of the people in this movie. It's just, there's like a curse on this movie, it seems like. And I'm very curious to know your thoughts on the Kyle Moxon storyline. I just thought it was out of a different movie, and it didn't really work for me at all.
Again, I think there was more deleted scenes than were led to be believed. Um, it felt like they cut this down to 90 minutes, and then they eliminated how like most of the storyline with the brother and added the stuff with the teacher stripper. That's what it feels like to me, because there's clearly some other storyline they just abandoned because all this stuff is going on in the background of all the kitchen scenes. So I'm just kind of thinking like, what the hell's going on? And then he starts a cult, and then the mom's like, "Oh, how cute! You started a cult," and I'm just like, what the fuck are we doing here? It's like there's some other darker movie going on in the background, and it's just like whatever that was just kind of like abandoned, and they just kind of left these leftover scenes in the background because they had just had to, because they had to continue the plot the other way around, and they needed these scenes to happen still. And they got the little brother in the background doing a cult or nailing himself to a cross or something crazy like that. So I don't know what the hell was going on, but I'm telling you, there are some deleted scenes in this movie that they have to be like explaining some of the shit, because otherwise it's just too random. Like, it has nothing to do with the movie, which makes me think, like, I don't know what the like idea was to have all these little, like, if you want to like talk about CTE and racism and like how football affects the whole town and all those kind of things, and then you got this thing about the little brother having a religious like enlightenment, like he does. I don't know, man. It was so random. So it's very, I don't know. That again, this marks down the script for me a lot, because it just feels so all over the place when he's in the background of these scenes, you know. And I kind of mentioned like it's got this Iron Claw feel. It's probably because of the whole Texas vibe, the family, sports family kind of vibe. So I did get that Iron Claw vibe, but then once I saw the little brother, and I was like, okay, this is far beyond anything want to be a musician or anything like that. This is something totally out there, and they just kind of just abandoned it. They just, all the storylines they built up are just abandoned after the game. So that's kind of how I feel about it, because yeah, there's a lot left on the table. Like, what happened to the teacher? Why did we even get introduced to the teacher in the first place? It felt like she was gonna like start dating Billy Bob or something, and they just didn't go with that either. So I don't know, man. But at least Billy Bob got the win. He was crying. I thought that was a little cool moment because he's a crier. So that we've seen those types of players in the NFL crying their eyes out, and they're giants on the field kind of thing. So that was kind of cool. And I guess this leads to the final part of the discussion. I don't know if you want to talk about like coaching, but this seems like it shows you where the NFL is going in terms of coaching, right? It feels like nowadays you kind of put more trust. If you want to win and be more successful in the NFL, you got to put more trust in your quarterback. Let them call audibles on the field. If they see something you don't on the field, let them call, because they're the ones on the field seeing things. It feels like that's what happened to Andy Reid, right? He was very stick by the playbook throughout Philadelphia. Once he got Patrick Mahomes, he realized, okay, this kid can see things on the field that I'm not seeing. And he's calling these audibles and getting to these other receivers and tight ends that you wouldn't think of during the play, or he's lateraling, something crazy like that. And you kind of see this in Varsity Blues, this conflict between star quarterback and coach. And it seems like that's where we are in the NFL today, where you got to rely more on the quarterback to call these audibles, because sometimes the play you draw up is not going to be the play that should be drawn up for the play. Does that make sense?
Well, I think the emphasis is also on getting away from just running the ball too. I think that part of Texas football and old school football lore is, okay, we're gonna run the ball and we're gonna pass only when it's necessary. And I think what Mox's point is that in order to evolve your offense and to be more successful, you have to make those changes. And I think Lance sees that as well. And I think that essentially what you see them doing is like inventing the air raid offense, where it's you're putting 4 or 5 wide receivers out there, and maybe you don't even have a running back on the field, and you're just really, again, putting the emphasis on throwing the ball. And that's essentially how they are able to come back and pick up the victory. So I think that's one of the more interesting elements that I think they almost should have put more emphasis on is just the evolution of high school offenses and how it's changing. And like even the fans are not sure what to think when they see 5 receivers out there. But I think for me, what I would have been curious to see with this movie is to have gotten more into the coaching dynamics, because really you have John Boyd, but you don't really have any coordinators. You have a training person. I don't know. Maybe this is a high school football thing. Like maybe they don't rely on a lot of assistant coaches. I don't know, especially in 1999. So I kind of struggle with that. But I do have to say that despite the flaws, I still think that there are some really enjoyable parts. And I do like the bit with Mox throwing footballs at the mascots, especially the first one. The second one wasn't as funny because he hit it like you could see the guy's face that he was on a horse. The first time it was funny because it's just a guy in a suit. I don't know what. Maybe it's just seeing a human being. Maybe that's the difference. But it's very impressive, and I love that little bit. And again, there are just those little moments of Mox being very annoyed at what's going on around him, the utter chaos. But I appreciate the fact that, yes, he is a smart individual, clearly, who wants to go to Brown, but he also kind of knows where he's at. He also knows what's important. He's clearly grown up with these people, knows the value of football. There's so many in the town, and I think he is very respectful of it and non-judgmental of it. And in so many ways, he is the conscience of this movie. He is the conscience of the team. And I think that ultimately, I think that's why this movie still works and is worth checking out.
For sure, and I gotta make a shout out to the soundtrack. It's all over. I mean, it's MTV, so you know they're gonna get all the cool songs, and they got a lot of cool songs for this one. I mean, they got Green Day, they had AC/DC's Thunderstruck, they had Hot for Teacher playing on, and that was the other thing too. Is like the teacher is like doing a teacher gimmick when she's stripping, and I was just like, can you make it more obvious that you are you're moonlighting as a stripper? But
yeah, that's not great. Do you want a hot take?
Go for it.
Hot for Teacher is not a good song.
I love the video. I mean, it's a good song in terms of the Van Halen
kind of. I'm not saying that because I'm a teacher, but I don't think that song is very good.
I'm a big Van Halen fan, and for me, it's always kind of like in the mid tier for me. I always kind of go for like the more love song types with when they went with Hagar, but you know, what's his name? David Lee Roth, I think, will always be the legend. And I think it's his influence on the MTV age that kind of like made videos crazier and crazier in the 90s. That's kind of my opinion on it. Because if you look at the Hot for Teacher video, it's pretty much what it was in Varsity Blues in terms of like the strip club thing. So yeah. And then of course they played what do you call it? Foo Fighters' My Hero, which is, of course, the song that Dave Grohl wrote about his hero, his personal hero, Kurt Cobain. So every time I hear that song in a movie, it kind of hits harder because knowing the story behind that, the song and the lyrics, it kind of hits harder knowing about it's mainly about Kurt Cobain. But in this case, it was kind of cool because, you know, they played My Hero right when they were making that comeback in the game. So that was kind of cool. And, of course, there's all these other tracks. It's a long list of tracks, too. So look it up. It's very much 1999 MTV. Alt rock mixed with like some hip hop and stuff. So there you go.
All right. So just in general, the positives, good performances, especially James Van Der Beek. I think those are the things that really work. Again, I really like that they went all the way with John Voight being irredeemable, Mox being a good ally, seemingly a good friend to all. I really like that. One of the more likable lead characters that we've talked about in quite some time. And again, I think the football is shot extremely well. The negatives, you are much higher on the music than I am. I'm not a huge fan of the soundtrack. I feel like it's pretty all over the place. And again, I know it's MTV and it's a mixed bag, but it just felt like the music should have been a little bit better. The brother storyline is weird. What's in the needle? I guess, like, is it steroids? Like, what is going on? Like, if you tear something, I don't know that anything in that needle is going to magically just make them be able to.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they got it mixed up on that when they were kind of reading their steroid facts and kind of mixing things up. Because that's, if you notice, they were injecting Paul Walker before the game, which makes sense because the dude's hurt. So they're trying to get some steroids in there to kind of, you know, genetically protect his knee or whatever, how it goes. And we've heard the stories of Lance Armstrong shooting in the middle of the Tour de France on his brakes, literally shooting up with steroids. So it's not like, I get the concept and the idea, but the idea that it's post-injury, that's the part that doesn't make sense.
The parents are cartoon characters. Again, I needed one parent to not be a complete idiot. And I also want to point out the cops are idiots too. I mean, you illustrated it when you talked about Scott Conn driving around the police car, but I mean, you're talking about a bunch of Barney Fifes here. Let's talk about the fact that everybody in this movie is canceled in some way. We have Allie Larter's behavior on the hero set towards one of her co-workers. You have James Van Der Beek making anti-Joe Biden comments last year, and Fox News like holding him up as some sort of a hero. John Voight is a complete lunatic to the point where his daughter Angelina Jolie will not talk to him. So yeah, this movie's all over the place. And of course, you have the one of the people is missing. Poor Ron Lester has died. So Varsity Blues is very cursed. It seems like.
Except for the director.
Paul Walker is dead as well.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that part too. And then the director ends up being the president of Paramount. So I don't know how that
which could be a curse in its own way.
I don't know. Failing up. We've talked about failing upward in terms of like Chris Farley movies and stuff like that, but this is truly failing upward because this dude did Ready to Rumble right after this, and I'm just thinking like, my God, how did the guy who directed Ready to Rumble end up as the president of Paramount? And look, he must be like really close to Tom Cruise if you're the president of Paramount, right? Because that Mission Impossible franchise.
I mean, you say that, but
Paramount.
Cruise just signed a deal to make movies with Warner Brothers. So, I mean, obviously he has been with Paramount for quite some time, so there has to be some element of that there. But it's weird. So, what are we going to be doing moving forward in the month of March? Brian, we are done with football. Football is basically done until the fall. So we are going to be transitioning into something new. It's not quite baseball season, so March is going to be a hodgepodge of different things. But we decided, so we talked about, we pull from the endless queue of movies and TV shows, but we've also said other things as well. So we are going to do something a little bit different next week, Brian. Why don't you tell the people what we're going to be reviewing next week? Since I brought up the idea of reviewing an Academy Award show, and Brian is the one that kind of brought it home with a very specific choice.
Well, I found this VHS when I was younger. Like my parents used to tape random stuff. Obviously, that was the era. And one of them said Academy Awards 1992. And I'm just like, what? So I watched that when I was younger. And I just remember a lot of things from that show. And that's the show where Jodie Foster wins Best Actress. Silence of the Lambs is nominated at the awards. Jonathan Demme, I believe, wins Best Director. That's the one where City Slickers, Jack Palance gets nominated for Best. He wins for Best Supporting Actor and does push-ups on stage at 70-something years old. And there's a lot of cool moments in this Academy Awards that I remember. So it kind of comes full circle. I know the True Detective thing. I don't know. Some people didn't like the ending. I haven't watched it yet, but I'm really intrigued because it somehow connects to the first season. And, there's this tie-in with, of course, Jodie Foster being a detective, looking for a killer. That's a vibe that's kind of familiar. So I get that. So I feel like it's kind of like it makes sense to do it now and pick this one.
I also want to point out that Terminator 2 wins a number of technical awards, and George Lucas gets the Irving Thalberg Award. So this will be a very interesting show because we are going to be talking about a George Lucas who is 7 years away from releasing The Phantom Menace. So we're going to be at a very interesting time in his career. We're going to talk about Billy Crystal as well and a whole lot more. Paul Newman and Elizabeth Taylor are the presenters for Best Picture, so I'm sure that will be very interesting among so many other things.
For sure. And then we can kind of go over some crazy Oscar stats that year because I think, if I'm correct, like Silence of the Lambs is one of the first movies that was released early, like February 91, and carried that momentum a year later to the Oscars, which is really hard to do. And it hasn't been done since, I think, Everything Everywhere at Once has done that because that came out in March, carried that momentum to a year later at the Oscars March a year later.
Crash in 2003 or 2004 was a summer release, and it was able to keep up the momentum for a few months.
It's really hard to do because that's why if you notice a lot of these Oscar winners come out in the winter because it's fresh into the award season. But for a movie to do it from February, it shows you that they didn't have plans for it.
And what I would say is the last 2 years have kind of proven that to be a fallacy because Everything Everywhere All at Once is an April release, and Oppenheimer, which is the big favorite to sweep the Academy Awards. I mean, there is a very real possibility that Oppenheimer wins double-digit numbers of Oscars at this point. I mean, it is all but assured at least 2 acting awards, Best Director and Best Picture. That's 4 right there. I think it's going to do really well in the technical categories. So Oppenheimer was a July release, as we all know. It was released the same day as Barbie. So, yeah, I don't know how the true that is, but we're going to go over some Academy Award stuff next week. So the reason that we are going through the Academy Award next week is because the Academy Awards for 2024 are Sunday, March 10th, and we want to do the review before the Academy Awards. That's how it makes sense. Now, usually the first Tuesday, we pair up with a wrestling match. I do not want to review any of the Slammy Awards. I don't want to watch 96, 97, or any of the Raws, especially the one hosted by Dennis Miller, which is an all-time bad episode of Raw. So we are going to postpone that until week 2. When Brian, I know we've got something special planned for that. We'll make that announcement next week. But Brian, anything else as we wrap up football February?
Well, officially, I think I'm going to put Varsity Blues as a 6.5 out of 10. I think a lot of the issues are just the script. But again, memorable moments, memorable characters. So there you go on that. In terms of football movies, I'd say the ones we watch any given Sunday still the top one. Little Giants, very nostalgic, but I feel like the football movie hasn't like stayed its course or overstayed its welcome. But it seems like the baseball movie has, right? So this is a little tease, but we're going to start something baseball-wise too. And for the next, for the whole baseball season, I'm going to be doing a little something special. And we'll talk about that towards the end of March when we kind of start my little baseball project that I'm taking Jerome along. So there you go for that little tease.
Absolutely. I'm going to give Varsity Blues a 7 out of 10. So I really did like it a little bit more than Brian. But for Brian, I'm Jerome. Thank you so much for listening. We will talk to you again next week.